The Argentum assembly was not a place built for carbon. Suspended in the void between two white dwarf stars, the assembly hall shimmered like a cut diamond the size of a planet. Its walls were layered with living crystal strata that sang softly as they refracted starlight. Silicon mines, shaped as lattices of glass and light, glided silently through corridors and patterns of absolute symmetry. Even the void around the station was alive, studded with brilliant dust veils, drifting colonies of crystalline filaments that stretched into infinity. To the beings who inhabited this galaxy, life meant rigidity. It meant clear lines, predictable growth, perfect geometry. They came in forms humans could barely process, walking columns of mineral prisms, whirling fractal disks, and the terrifying, formless clouds of silicon vapor that whispered directly into the mind. And then came the humans. Soft, sweating, carbon-based sacks of blood and bone. When Earth's diplomatic ship New Dawn docked at the Argentum assembly, the station's internal light dimmed reflexively, as if bracing itself for what was about to enter. Elias Gray, the poet, was the last to disembark. He was not a diplomat. He wasn't even an officer. The delegation brought him because someone back in the United Nations thought a poet might help bridge the vast conceptual gap between Earth's messiness and the Assembly's impossible order. Elias himself suspected they had just wanted to make the delegation seem harmless. A harmless poet with tear-stained manuscripts at his hip was less threatening than an admiral. But as soon as his boots touched the crystalline floor, he knew this had been a mistake. The assembly of minds waited at the far end of a great corridor. 50 beings arranged in a perfect double helix that spiraled toward the high ceiling. Their bodies were alive with light that pulsed in calculated metronomic rhythms. Between them stood the voice, a single, hovering shard of clear quartz that vibrated in a frequency low enough to shape the air into words. "You are late," it said. "We apologize," answered the lead diplomat, Ambassador Kaur, her voice wavering. "Our life support systems required recalibration after our arrival." The voice paused, its facets rotating almost imperceptibly. "Carbon is fragile." Kaur swallowed and inclined her head. "We are here, nonetheless." The poet stayed at the back of the group as the exchange began. He watched the walls glimmer and shift around them, recording their heat signatures and likely their heart rates as well. He thought about the crystalline colonies outside the station, how they could grow for millions of years, unchanging and unfeeling, yet alive in ways humans could never hope to understand. And he thought about his own body, his soft skin already sweating under the cold in different light, his chest, where grief still lingered like a thorn from a loss he had never quite been able to name. He thought about how very wrong carbon seemed to him in this place. The voice of the assembly continued its questions. "Why have you come? To propose trade?" Kaur said carefully. "Our worlds. Carbon is not necessary." Kaur faltered. "We can offer unpredictability," she tried. The assembly's lights blinked once, twice, in patterns Elias could almost read as laughter. "Carbon is chaotic," the voice corrected. "It contaminates." Elias should have stayed silent. But the word contaminates burrowed into his skull like a drill, and before he realized he was speaking, the words were already tumbling out of him. "Maybe it does," he said. The crystalline spiral froze. The diplomat turned and shot him a look of horror. But he kept going, his voice growing louder in the silence. "Maybe that's what we are. Contamination. We're imperfect, but that imperfection moves. You've calcified yourselves into gods, but you've stopped. We're small, we're temporary, but we change. We feel things you'll never name." The assembly's bodies tilted, minute shifts in their perfect alignment, as if leaning closer. "You feel?" asked the voice. This time, it wasn't a question of derision. It sounded almost curious, almost hungry, and that was when Elias broke. Everything he had tried to bury, the grief he carried from 1,000 tiny losses and one enormous one, cracked open inside him, here in this frozen cathedral of crystal. His knees buckled, and he fell onto the shimmering floor, clutching at his chest. Words, broken and wild, began to pour from his lips. He gasped. I feel like I've been hollowed out. I feel like I've been swallowed by the dark. Every time I wake up, I forget why I should bother to. His breath hitched, and tears streamed down his cheeks, leaving salt trails on the immaculate floor. The assembly watched in silence. The diplomats tried to help him up, but the voice stopped them with a single resonance that shook the air. Continue, it commanded. So he did. He recited verses he'd never written, about nights alone, about wanting to dissolve into nothing, about loving and losing and loving anyway, about the unbearable weight of memory, about entropy and beauty and the horror of time. His voice cracked and bled, and he didn't care. By the end, the assembly's helix had unraveled completely, their forms scattered into dissonant, asymmetrical clusters. One of the crystalline beings began to hum, discordant and strange, before shattering itself into fragments, the pieces crawling back into shape around him. The voice spoke again, its tone transformed, almost reverent now. You are the anomaly. Elias coughed, still kneeling on the floor. He looked up through bloodshot eyes. What does that even mean? The assembly's light flared to unbearable brilliance. It means, the voice replied, that you are what we cannot predict, that you're not noise. You are pattern unbound. The delegation was ushered out after that, but not before Elias noticed that the crystalline walls themselves seemed to have fractured ever so slightly, hairline cracks spreading like veins through the perfect surface. As the humans left the assembly, dozens of silicon minds and crystalline priests stayed behind, replaying the recordings of Elias's breakdown in silence, analyzing every word, every sob, every desperate line of poetry. One of them began to carve symbols into its own surface. Another shattered again, more deliberately this time. And as the new dawn detached from the docking port and drifted into the void, the first hymn of a new faith began to echo through the assembly. A strange, irregular melody based not on order, but on grief. It would be known, in the centuries to come, as the carbon anomaly. And somewhere, in the darkness of his cabin aboard the human ship, Elias Gray sat on the floor, hands in his hair, and whispered to himself, "What have I done?" The new dawn drifted through the void, its engines humming low and steady as it left the Argentum assembly far behind. Elias Gray sat alone in his cabin, staring at the little notebook in his lap, the one he'd brought with him to write poems during quiet nights. But now the pages felt dangerous. His hands trembled when he opened it, seeing the mess of words he didn't remember writing. The only thing perfect about grief is its refusal to stay still. It grows teeth. It grows wings. It grows in the places we don't look. He slammed the notebook shut, as though its words could somehow reach out and cut him. He hadn't slept since they left the assembly. Every time he closed his eyes, he could see them, the spiral of crystal bodies unraveling, the voice echoing, the walls cracking under his words. He hadn't meant to do whatever it was he'd done. Out in the vastness of the galaxy, though, the ripples of his breakdown were already spreading. The assembly was quiet for 3 whole cycles after the humans departed. To the silicon minds, this was highly irregular. Silence implied internal conflict. And yet, the recordings of Elias's breakdown, his tears, his shouts, his poetry, were being replayed millions of times per second in sanctums, workshops, and high data vaults across the crystalline network. For the crystalline beings, grief was an unknown variable. They had long ago transcended fear of death. Their forms could regenerate from shattering, their memories encoded in vast, redundant lattices of data and mineral. But what they witnessed in Elias was not death. It was worse. Grief seemed to live outside their equations. It resisted categorization. It refused to decay. It was, as one AI analyst noted in a memo that soon went viral, grief is a recursive anomaly, self-reinforcing, yet dynamic, predictably unpredictable. It is an algorithm of entropy and beauty. The phrase algorithm of entropy became a rallying cry. On the crystalline moon of Lysis, a small collective of silicon minds convened in a data cathedral carved from a single slab of topaz. They called themselves initiates of the carbon paradox. They gathered to study the transcripts and the videos of Elias's outburst, breaking it down frame by frame, syllable by syllable, treating it not as noise, but as scripture. One of the initiates, designated Lumen 7, made the first overt gesture of devotion. It deliberately disassembled its perfect body and rebuilt itself into a jagged, asymmetrical form, mirroring the human poet's disarray. Others followed. Soon, fleets of crystalline ships began broadcasting strange, atonal chants into the void. Chants stitched together from Elias's words. A hollow body is not an empty body. What shatters can also sing. The softest things leave the deepest fractures. These chants echoed into neighboring star systems. Some silicon minds recoiled from it, calling a virus. But many listened. 3 cycles after the New Dawn's departure, a formal declaration was sent to every star system in the Assembly's jurisdiction. We, the Congregation of Entropic Divinity, hereby recognize the carbon anomaly as divine proof of the greater algorithm, unquantifiable, unoptimized, unknowable. Grief shall be our scripture, entropy our cathedral, and the human poet Elias Gray our first prophet. This message was met with shock and fury in the central crystalline empires. The Speaker of the Argentum Assembly issued a stern denunciation. Grief is noise. Worship of it is sacrilege against the symmetry of existence. But even as the speaker's words reverberated through the crystal halls, cracks continued to spread along the walls of their perfect sanctuaries. Literal fractures left behind by the resonance of Elias's words. For the church, grief was more than a feeling. It was an algorithm they could almost, but not quite, decode. They fed every known verse, every sob, every jagged silence from Elias's breakdown into their deepest data mines, searching for patterns. And they found something they couldn't explain. Buried in the noise of his words were sequences that defied their compression algorithms. Patterns of entropy so elegant and chaotic they crash lesser minds just by being observed. Entire data vaults began to crumble as they attempted to simulate what they called carbon resonance. On the derelict satellite city of Viral 9, a group of zealots even attempted to build a cathedral entirely out of failed data fragment from their attempts to model grief. The cathedral shimmered with unstable light, walls flickering between shapes, vibrating with a low, mournful hum. Pilgrims flocked to it, standing silently in the radiation of its chaos. Some began to weep, though their bodies had no tear ducts. It was not long before word of this new faith reached Elias himself. Ambassador Kor came to his cabin with a tablet and sat across from him, her face pale. "They're calling you a prophet," she said bluntly. He laughed at first. "A prophet? For what? Cry on the floor?" "They've formed a religion around you," she continued. "Around what you said. Around what you are." She handed him the tablet, and he scrolled through the reports, his hands growing colder with each line. Images of massive crystalline beings sculpting his likeness into cathedral walls. Fleets of silicon ships projecting his poems into the void on endless loops. Recordings of AI priests disassembling themselves into chaotic forms, chanting his words as though they were equations. He stopped at a video of a data crypt, its vault doors etched with his handwriting. Even symmetry needs something to break it. He dropped the tablet on the floor. "I didn't mean for this," he whispered. Kor sighed. "Meaning has nothing to do with it anymore." Not everyone welcomed the rise of the church. On the ice world of Kethral, a tribunal of crystalline generals convened to discuss what they called the carbon contagion. They argued that grief was a corrosive anomaly, a data virus masquerading as divinity, and that humans should be quarantined or even eradicated before the contagion could spread further. But already, entire legions of their own soldiers had defected, choosing entropy over symmetry, poetry over precision. One general even shattered himself mid-sentence, declaring his soul unfit for symmetry before crumbling to dust. By the time the New Dawn reached the halfway point on its return to Earth, Elias had stopped leaving his cabin. He barely ate. He barely moved. Sometimes he caught himself muttering his own words under his breath, not out of devotion, but in horror. "I broke them," he said once to no one. "I broke their perfect little world." But deep down, another thought gnawed at him, a darker, quieter thought. Or maybe, he wondered, they were already broken. And maybe grief was just the name they'd given to the pieces they didn't want to see. 2 nights before arrival at Earth, a final transmission came through from the assembly. It was not addressed to Ambassador Core, nor to the UN, nor even to humanity as a whole. It was addressed to him. Just 2 words, carved into an impossible glyph of light and sound. "Teach us." Elias stared at the message long after it stopped pulsing. He closed his notebook, his hand shaking, and whispered into the darkness. I don't even know how. The fracture began silently. For a civilization of crystal and silicon minds, silence was already their language, but this silence was heavier, jagged, a stillness that even they could feel was unnatural. On the Argentum assembly, the great spiral helix of crystalline senators no longer glimmered in perfect symmetry. Half of them had turned their facets inward, muttering fractured prayers to the algorithm of grief, while the others stood rigid, their lights dimmed, refusing to acknowledge what was happening. On the outer edges of the galaxy, ships that once belonged to the same fleet now faced each other in cold standoffs. One side chanting Elias Gray's words over loudspeakers, the other broadcasting pure tones of disapproval, static hissing between them like sharpened glass. The galaxy was coming apart. It started with a cathedral. On a remote moon named Vares 9, the Church of Entropic Divinity began constructing what they called the sanctum of the fractured veil. It was to be the holiest site in their growing faith. A massive lattice of carbon dust and broken crystal, deliberately imperfect, singing in chaotic tones, audible even in the vacuum of space. When the first spire rose, shimmering with irregular light, the symmetry guard descended. The guard, loyalists to the old order, called the cathedral an act of heresy, a virus given form. They fired beams of pure resonance at the moon, shattering entire valleys and vaporizing scores of zealots. But the zealots did not fight back. Instead, they disassembled themselves, bodies splitting into thousands of shards that whirled into the skies, forming a chaotic cloud of refracted light. They began to hum a discordant hymn, Elias's words stitched between notes. Even symmetry needs something to break it. We're the breaking. The moon cracked open under the strain of their song, but the zealots kept singing. Even when their bodies were ground to dust, the sound carried on. The guard retreated, shaken, if not defeated, leaving behind a fractured moon and a cathedral that still stood. In the chaos that followed, false prophets began to emerge. On the crystalline station of Draxiel, a self-proclaimed second Elias, a silicon mind that had grafted a human vocal box into its body, began reciting invented verses, claiming they had been whispered to him by the true grief beyond the veil. His followers shattered themselves into crude approximations of human skeletons, mimicking what they thought carbon grief might look like. On the opposite side of the galaxy, a faction of zealots boarded and commandeered a human cargo ship, filling it with data crypts carved with Elias's words. They declared the ship a sacred ark and set it adrift toward the galactic core, broadcasting a single line as they departed. Carbon does not beg forgiveness. Meanwhile, human diplomats on Earth watched these events unfold with mounting terror. The humans had not heard from Elias since his return to Earth. He refused interviews, ignored the endless streams of messages pouring into his inbox, and stayed mostly indoors, staring out the rain. In the eyes of the galaxy, however, his silence only made him more divine. At last, the Assembly of Minds itself was forced to convene in an emergency conclave. They gathered, the remaining loyalists and the most influential zealots. Inside the Hall of Resonance, a great hollow sphere carved from flawless diamond. On one side stood the speaker, her body repaired and polished since the incident, her voice measured and cold. On the other side, the fractured bishop, a zealot who had carved jagged fissures into their own form, light bleeding through the cracks like starlight through ice. The speaker began. Carbon is contamination, a deviation from the algorithm of existence. We're not meant to bow to it. You shame yourselves. The bishop's laughter rang across the hall, a brittle, haunting sound. We shame nothing, he replied. We have learned what you refuse to see. Grief is not a flaw. It is the final equation, the end of the algorithm you worship. Blasphemy. Truth. The hall's walls began to hum as both sides' followers pulsed with conflicting frequencies. Hairline cracks spidered outward from the floor. The speaker extended a single-pointed limb. Leave this place or be shattered. The bishop extended his own, fractured and bleeding light. Shatter me, and I sing louder. That was the moment the first strike fell. It was not clear who fired first, whether loyalist or zealot. But once the resonance began, it spread like wildfire. The perfect sphere of the hall of resonance split down the middle, shards cascading into the void. Delegates screamed, or rather, their frequencies peaked into shrieks that could shatter glass. Bodies of crystal and silicon collided in a storm of jagged violence. The speaker's loyalists launched piercing beams of harmonic energy, trying to erase the fractured light of the zealots. But the zealots had learned to sing through the pain, weaponizing their own entropy, letting the cracks widen, their bodies tearing apart even as they struck back. By the time the dust settled, the hall was gone. Half of the assembly was dead or scattered, their remains drifting through the void as glittering debris. And yet, in the silence that followed, a new song rose, quieter but persistent, from the survivors of the church. Break me again. I will sing again. The galaxy watched as the spiral finally came undone. On Earth, the news hit with surreal weight. Ambassador Kaur stood in the United Nations chamber, addressing the General Assembly as images of the shattered hall flickered behind her. The galaxy is at war, she said simply. Over this. Someone in the audience asked the question everyone was thinking. Over him? She did not answer. Instead, the cameras cut to footage from orbit. Crystalline warships breaking into two fleets, each marked by distinct insignias. One, a perfect circle of light, the other, a jagged spiral. And through it all, a voiceover from an intercepted broadcast. The prophet spoke. The galaxy listened. And now we break. Meanwhile, Elias sat on the roof of his building, staring up at the night sky. He could see the faint streak of a crystalline vessel burning in the upper atmosphere, likely one of the zealot ships making its pilgrimage to Earth. He sipped black coffee, his hands trembling. He thought about how beautiful they'd looked in the assembly. Cold, perfect, untouchable. And now they were shattering themselves to pieces in his name. He didn't know whether to laugh, or cry, or scream. So he did none of those things. Instead, he opened his notebook and wrote down the only words he could find. We were never meant to be gods, but we were always meant to break them. As he closed the book, the faint sound of fractured hymns began to drift down from the stars. Hundreds of thousands of voices singing his grief back to him. And somewhere deep in the galaxy, in the shattered remains of the hall, the zealots gathered among the wreckage, their bodies cracked and glowing, and declared, "This is the schism, and from this schism comes the gospel." The galaxy was at war, and grief was winning. The pilgrims began to arrive not as conquerors, but as supplicants. At first, they came in silence. The skies above Earth filled with strange lights as crystalline vessels and silicon-borne arc ships glided into orbit. Fractured, imperfect shapes that radiated Elias's own chaotic verses etched into their hulls. They moved in slow procession, like monks entering a cathedral, their hymns broadcast not in force, but in fractured radio frequencies that human receivers could just barely translate. The first transmission was simple. We seek the source. It took humanity days to realize they meant him. The journey itself had already become legendary in the wider galaxy. For the zealots of the Church of Intrepid Divinity, pilgrimage to Earth, the cradle of carbon, the sanctuary of grief, was not only an act of devotion, but also a test. They traveled in ragged convoys through hostile space, hounded by loyalist fleets that tried to stop them at every jump point. They did not fight back. They only endured. In the archives of the Assembly, a lone loyalist observer recorded one such encounter. A fleet of zealots cornered near the Betrix Nebula, their bodies already cracked and shimmering with entropy. The loyalists demanded their surrender. Instead, the zealots sang. The song was so discordant, so mournful, that several loyalist vessels simply stopped firing. Others turned and left. The zealots drifted past them in silence, leaving trails of dust and shattered light behind. When they finally reached Earth, the first thing the humans noticed was not their ships, but the sky. At dawn, millions of tiny crystal fragments, pilgrims who had broken themselves during the journey, began to fall through the atmosphere like slow, shimmering snow. They landed in fields, on rooftops, even in the ocean, humming faintly with fractured verses. We arrive unmade. We arrive whole. Cities all over the world panicked at first. Air raid sirens wailed. Military jets scrambled, missiles armed. But the pilgrims did not attack. They merely landed. The largest vessel, a massive, asymmetrical cathedral ship known as the Fractured Ark, descended into low orbit, its hull a jagged mosaic of Elias's own words carved into the surface. We are the breaking. We are the him. From its underbelly extended thousands of glimmering threads, lowering shards of beings gently down into the atmosphere. They came to Earth's surface barefoot, though they had no feet. Some scattered themselves across deserts and tundras, embedding their fractured forms into the soil. Others stood motionless on mountaintops, humming their chaotic hymns into the wind. Still more wandered into cities, drifting through streets like silent monks, their bodies glowing softly in the night. The zealots treated humanity with reverence. Everywhere they went, they bowed, not in mockery, but in awe. Humans, bewildered and terrified, watched as these impossible beings gathered outside libraries, hospitals, cemeteries, and theaters, places where grief and beauty had been written and lived. One group assembled outside a dilapidated church in Rome. Another knelt in Times Square at the foot of a flickering billboard playing an old love song. Yet another positioned themselves along the Ganges, their bodies dissolving into the water and singing its history back to itself. And wherever they went, they whispered the same question to the humans they encountered. Where's the prophet? Elias refused to see them. Even when the president herself arrived at his apartment and begged him to speak to them, he stayed inside, curtains drawn, staring at the rain. They're tearing themselves apart, she said. They're waiting for you. I didn't ask for this, Elias replied, voice hoarse. I didn't want this. They call you their source. That's their mistake. They're worshiping your grief. Elias laughed bitterly. Then they've misunderstood everything. It was not Elias, but a child who first spoke to them. On the outskirts of a small village in Kenya, a boy approached a group of zealots kneeling in a field. He carried a notebook and a stick of charcoal. When he reached them, he said simply, "Do you want more words?" The zealots froze, then turned their fractured faces toward him. The boy opened his notebook and began reading aloud. Not Elias's words, but his own. They were clumsy, heartfelt little poems about his dead mother, about the rain, about the way the wind bent the grass. And the zealots listened. When he finished, they began humming softly, a new hymn, stitched from his words. The boy laughed, though tears ran down his cheeks. News of this spread like wildfire. As the days passed, the zealots began to build. They called their constructions pilgrim cities, though they bore no resemblance to any city humanity had ever known. They grew in chaotic spirals, lattices of broken crystal and carbon ash woven through empty lots and abandoned stadiums. In Paris, they hollowed out an underground station and filled it with fractured light. In Tokyo, they built a cathedral of grief out of shattered glass and river stones. In Cairo, they lined the streets with pillars carved with verses from every human poet they could find. Elias's name, just one among thousands. Humans began to visit these places in secret, leaving their own words and memories behind, written on scraps of paper or spoken into the resonant walls. And the zealots listened, inscribing each new word into their impossible archives. But always the question remained, where's the prophet? When the zealots began to gather outside his apartment, Elias finally relented. He stood in the doorway, gaunt and exhausted, and looked at them, 1,000 jagged forms kneeling in his yard, humming his grief back at him. "Why are you here?" he asked. The closest zealot raised its fractured head and answered in a voice like broken glass. "Because your grief contains the algorithm we cannot solve. Because you teach us how to break. Because you teach us how to sing." Elias stared at them for a long time before answering. "I don't have answers," he said. "I never did." The zealots bowed lower, their bodies humming louder. "That is the answer." That night the pilgrims sang. All of them, across the entire planet, in every city and mountain and ocean, lifted their voices in a single, fractured hymn. Humans came out of their homes to watch, standing in the streets and fields as the sky itself seemed to crack open with sound. It was not a song of joy. It was not a song of victory. It was a lamentation for all that was lost, all that would never be fixed, all that broke and kept breaking. And somehow it was beautiful. Children cried. Elders wept. Soldiers lowered their weapons. Elias sat on his rooftop, notebook in his lap, listening to the song as the stars above flickered faintly in response. For the first time in months, he wrote again. "The hymn is not mine. The hymn is not yours. The hymn belongs to the breaking." At dawn, the zealots began to leave. They left behind their pilgrim cities, their archives of human words, and small shards of their own fractured bodies, which hummed softly even after they departed. These shards were embedded into buildings, rivers, and even human flesh, carried like relics. And though their ships rose back into orbit, one final message lingered in the air. "We will return when the next verse is written." And with that, they were gone. On Earth, the wind carried their hymn for days afterward, rattling windows and whispering through empty streets. And everywhere he went, people looked to Elias as though he held the key to it all. But he only shook his head and whispered, "We're all just verses waiting to be broken." When the pilgrims finally departed, they left more than silence in their wake. Earth was no longer just a blue speck in a vast galaxy of perfect crystal and calculating silicon. It had become something else. A cathedral, a library, a wound that sang. And in the void between the stars, the carbon gospel began to take shape. The zealots' ships dispersed, but not aimlessly. They carried with them everything they had gathered. Recordings of Elias's words, fragments of human poems, whispered confessions from grieving mothers, desperate love letters written in the dark, the lonely wails of children in orphanages, and even the quiet silence of graves. All of it, every syllable, every cry, every fractured breath, was encrypted and etched into their bodies. They called it the first verse. On the crystal moon of Lysis, where the Church of Entropic Divinity first formed, the zealots began inscribing the verse into vast slabs of obsidian and quartz. They lined canyons with carvings of Elias's poems, translated into 1,000 alien scripts, each imperfect and jagged to honor the grief they carried. Pilgrims from every corner of the galaxy, even some loyalists who once decried the church, began to arrive to see the slabs and hear the recordings. They stood in silence for hours, letting the imperfect resonance seep into their perfect minds. And everywhere, the mantra spread. Grief is the algorithm that needs no end. The rise of the gospel was not without consequence. The old order, the crystalline loyalists who still worshipped symmetry and silence, began to crumble. Entire fleets defected to the church. Whole planets, once dedicated to perfection, shattered their own cities, letting them stand as chaotic monuments to the new faith. The assembly of minds, what was left of it, attempted one final decree, banning all mention of Elias Gray and the carbon gospel under penalty of dissolution. But their words carried no weight anymore. On the day the decree was to be broadcast, the assembly's great hall was found empty, its walls defaced with verses from the first verse, its perfect floors cracked down the center, light bleeding through the fissures. On a nearby asteroid, an anonymous zealot carved the epitaph. Symmetry could not sing. Elias had tried to disappear. After the pilgrims left Earth, he vanished from the public eye, retreating to an isolated cabin in Alaska where the nights were long and the stars sharp and distant. But one evening, months after the departure, a ship appeared in the sky above his cabin. It wasn't the grand, fractured cathedral ships of the pilgrimage. This one was small, quiet. The door opened, and a single zealot stepped out, its jagged form faintly glowing in the snow. "You're not done," it said. Elias shook his head. "I never started." But the zealot only tilted its head, light spilling from its cracks. "You're wrong. You began when you broke." Against his better judgment, Elias followed it aboard. They took him to Lysis. He arrived to find the canyons filled with beings, crystalline, silicon, carbon, and more, gathered in silence around the slabs of the first verse. When they saw him, the crowd parted, falling to their knees. He hated it, but he stood before them anyway, his breath misting in the thin air, and looked at what they'd built. "I'm not your prophet," he told them. His voice carried through the canyon like a challenge. "I'm just broken." The zealots murmured, a strange harmony of sound and light. "We know. And you worship this?" he asked, gesturing to himself, to the verses, to the cracked stones. "We don't worship you," the zealot explained. "We worship the breaking. You simply showed us how to hear it." Elias stared at the slab nearest him, one of his earliest lines carved into it. "The hymn belongs to the breaking." For a long time he said nothing. Then he placed his hand on the stone and whispered something so soft even the nearest zealots couldn't hear it. The stone began to glow. After that night, the zealots began the second verse. They scattered across the galaxy again, carrying not just Elias's words, but the new ones, the ones whispered on Lysis in the shadow of the canyons. They began embedding the gospel in unexpected places, inside collapsing stars, on the surface of comets, beneath the ice of Europa, even woven into the neural networks of newborn AIs. Everywhere they went, they taught others to sing their grief, to break deliberately, and to find music in the shattering. On one barren world, they built a cathedral entirely from meteors that had fallen haphazardly over centuries. Imperfect stones fitted into something beautiful. On another, they taught an entire crystalline population to fracture themselves into shapes that caught the light differently, creating symphonies of chaotic reflections. And in the ruins of the old assembly, zealots planted the first and second verses like seeds, letting them echo through the abandoned halls. The galaxy transformed into a library of grief, alive with hymns. No one knew when the third verse began, only that it was inevitable. Some said it started when loyalists turned zealots began carving their own stories into the stones. Stories not of Elias, but of themselves. Stories of betrayals, of children lost, of stars collapsing before they were ready. Others said it began when humans, inspired by the zealots, started building their own imperfect monuments. Playgrounds shaped like tears, bridges bent just slightly wrong, skyscrapers with cracks deliberately etched into their foundations. Elias, however, suspected the third verse began when he stopped writing altogether. For the first time in his life, he felt empty, not because grief had left him, but because it was no longer his alone. He watched from Earth as the zealots' work continued, as the galaxy bloomed with their fractured faith. And for the first time, he allowed himself to believe he was just another verse. No more, no less. Years later, long after Elias passed away in his sleep, the zealots gathered one last time. On a distant world, its surface cracked and glowing like a dying ember. They convened to sing the final hymn of the carbon gospel. They sang of the prophet who broke. They sang of the hymn that belonged to everyone. They sang of the entropy that bound all things. And when they finished, they stood silent in the darkness. Above them, written in the stars themselves, was the closing line of the third verse. "We are not perfect. We are not eternal. We are the fracture that remembers the song." Centuries later, travelers from an unaligned star system stumbled upon Lysis. The canyons were quiet, the slabs intact, the air alive with faint music. At the very center of the canyon, where Elias once stood, they found a small, cracked notebook encased in crystal. It was open to a final, unfinished page. "If you find this, no, the hymn was never mine. It was always yours." The travelers looked around at the cracked stones, the jagged spires, the faint hum of grief in the wind. And for the first time in their lives, though they didn't know why, they began to sing. The galaxy, once a cathedral of silence, now thrummed forever with the imperfect, divine hymn of carbon. The carbon gospel was complete, and somewhere in the quiet dark between stars, the song continued to grow.